Welcome back. You're watching Market Sense. Now, while there's been this raging debate going on at the global level about the potential fiscal cliff that the United States faces before the end of this year, there seems to be little attention being paid to the potential fiscal cliff that India itself faces. And let's talk about the challenges before the Indian economy and essentially the timeline within which we need to try and set things right if we are to avert a crisis of that order. And to get a deeper perspective on the issue, we are joined on the show now by Sajid Chinoy, who's an economist at JP Morgan. He joins us now on the show. Now, Sajid, to begin with, would you say that one of the reasons why our finances in India are in a rather precarious position is because the centre did not move fast enough in withdrawing stimulus after it stepped in to help industry in 2008?
We had a very large fiscal stimulus in 2008, and if you remember, some of this began even before Lehman went under through the pay commission and the farm debt waiver. But that, in conjunction with the stimulus that followed, meant that the fiscal deficit went up 6 percentage points of GDP in 2008-9. Whether a stimulus of that size was warranted for an economy running at pretty high levels of capacity is very questionable. But I think what's worse is that even if it was warranted at the time, the very slow withdrawal of the stimulus over the last 2 years has meant that inflation has been very elevated, aggregate demand has been stronger than it had to, and in a way loose fiscal policy has undermined the monetary tightening.
Sajid, now nearly 4 years later, there's roughly 2% of the stimulus still lying in the system. Would you put this down to the pressures from the private sector that the government has succumbed to?
I'm not sure it's that. I think there wasn't a recognition for a long time that fiscal policy was contributing to high inflationary pressures. I think there was still the notion till about a year ago that all of our inflation was really structural. It was food inflation, it was supply side. And I think that led to a complacency in the withdrawal of the stimulus that should not have existed. As it turns out, strong aggregate demand, because the stimulus still lies in the system, actually pushed this economy to grow beyond its capacity and kept inflation high. So I think it's really a lack of recognition of what the true drivers of inflation were.
Now, Sajid, it is often argued by a number of people that the last 2 years could potentially have been a terrific period for India had we only gotten our act right on the policy front. Now, the absence of other global investment avenues for foreign investors will have driven capital into India. The rupee will have been in a far stronger position. The impact of higher oil prices will have been that much lower. A number of factors that will essentially have worked to the benefit of India. Would you agree?
I think that very loose fiscal policy has contributed significantly to crowding out investment and kind of vitiating investor sentiment. If you think back to India's primary deficit, we actually ran a surplus in 2007-8 of about 1% of GDP. That's now a deficit of 3.5% of GDP. So the swing has been almost 5 percentage points of GDP, which is identical to the reduction in corporate private investment. So in my view, the biggest problem that India has had over the last 4 years is that the private investment cycle has not kicked in like it did in the mid-2000s. And part of that, I think, was because the government essentially was competing for the same domestic savings that the private sector was. And in a sense, what's worse, it pushed some of the corporates to borrow offshore. And those have got exchange rate risks as well, as we now know.
Right, and Sajid, we also have aspects such as MSPs on agri-produce, the wage indexation on Narega, and a rising subsidy bill allowing greater spending power to the consumer, and that's playing a havoc on inflation. But given that a fragile coalition political system seems to be the order of the day, must we just come to terms with the issues such as these remaining a constant, and that we ought to work our way around these things while fighting inflation?
Well, it's very hard to see how you can achieve any kind of fiscal consolidation or avert any kind of ratings downgrade in the next 6 months or so if you don't tackle the issue of subsidies. Frankly, I think the fiscal deficit this year will be challenged quite significantly because GDP growth is going to be much lower than what was budgeted. Oil prices are quite high. So unless you bite the bullet on subsidies, it's virtually impossible to reach the kind of fiscal consolidation that this country needs. And without that happening, I don't think inflation rates go down. and I don't think the RBI will be in any position to ease policy. So I think we have to recognize that high and stubborn inflation is as detrimental to consumption and to poverty alleviation as anything else, and fiscal profligacy, frankly, has been a key contributor of that inflation.
Now, Sajid, we all agree that the current path that our government finances are on are just not sustainable. But what's the way out? Because no option seems politically feasible.
Yes, but I think the option of not doing anything in the next 6 or 9 months is even worse. I do believe that if India suffers a rating downgrade, it pushes up the cost of capital for everybody. I think the rupee could come under very significant pressure. That will put more pressure on inflation and constrain the RBI's hands even more. So I think there is no option anymore of doing nothing. I think we have to, recognizing what the constraints are, move both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. I think it would be useful to actually get some traction on the disinvestment program to get that moving. I think some kind of subsidy rationalization will have to take place, and frankly I think outside of subsidies as well, we'll have to slow the growth of expenditures more generally.
Now Sajid, it's been a good 4 months since S&P warned us of a rating downgrade to junk. Since then we've not budged an inch on setting things right. Must we expect a Europe-like situation where the policymakers will cobble together a half-baked plan just weeks before we may be faced with an actual downgrade?
Well, that's an open question, but I think we have to recognize that the constraints just get more and more binding. Remember, this is a relatively light period in terms of an election calendar. 2013, we have 10 state elections. 2013 is the last budget before the general election. So if politically hard decisions are not possible in the next few months, it's very unlikely that they will actually happen in 2013. I think the ratings agencies understand that. I think clearly, we'll get some breathing space because we've had a drought-like situation. Some automatic stabilizers will kick in. I think ratings agencies will see through that. But fundamentally, till the next budget, if we don't make progress on reducing our structural fiscal deficit, which has grown so much over the last 3 years, my worry is that there's a very good chance over the next 6 months that ratings agencies will act sooner than later. Remember, in the post-Lehman era, unfortunately, the ratings agencies would rather make type 1 errors and move too soon than make type 2 errors and move too late and be accused of being irrelevant.
Now, so essentially, Sajid, the window for us then to set things right in order to avert a downgrade is just getting narrower and narrower. At the same time, the macro picture only seems to be getting worse. So what if we do go to junk?
Well, I think we have to recognize that what happens then is the borrowing costs we have, for example, a stock of more than 100 billion of ECBs. Last year, 25 billion of that had to be refinanced. This is another year where refinancing, the fractions that have to be refinanced are large. So those costs go up very sharply. More generally, I think capital flows in India would be significantly constrained in the event of a downgrade. So a lot of this borrowing which is happening offshore will come onshore and put increased pressure on domestic lending rates. So I think that's one clear impact where domestic lending rates threaten to rise because a lot of corporates who are borrowing in the overseas market will now be forced to borrow onshore. And therefore, even firms that are not directly exposed to foreign borrowing will experience a rise in their borrowing costs. Now, we already know that corporates have been complaining about implementation bottlenecks on the ground. If you add to that mix a sharp financial shock, that could have a very significant impact on investment. Lastly, I think we shouldn't underestimate if the BOP comes under pressure in the event of a downgrade, what that will do to the Indian currency. And if the rupee were to weaken even further, that just fuels more inflation, makes the oil subsidy bill even larger, and puts even more pressure on inflation.
All right, Sajid Chennai, thanks very much for joining us on the show and talking to us about the challenges that the government faces and the incredibly short timeline that we have to set things right. Prakash Gaba was, of course, with us on the show, and so Prakash, thanks very much for staying with us throughout this last hour to talk to us about stocks that you find interesting. But we've run completely out of time on the show. From Avan, me and the rest of the team that put this show together, thanks very much for watching.